Professor Dorothy. Sterling pressed her weathered hands against the train window as the Kansas prairie stretched endlessly before her. Golden wheat fields, interrupted only by the occasional farmhouse. Her two children, 11-year-old Storm and 8-year-old Prairie, slept against her shoulders, their small bodies swaying with the rhythmic clacking of the rails. The letter from Ezra Whitman remained folded in her pocket, its promises of a new life and a ready-made home weighing heavily on her mind. She had left her position at the agricultural college in Illinois with nothing but her books, her children, and the hope that scientific farming could find acceptance in this untamed land. The conductor's voice, announcing Dry Creek Station, next stop, made her stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. The small depot stood alone against the vast sky, its weathered boards gray with age and neglect, while a handful of locals gathered to witness the arrival of the afternoon train. Dot gathered her children and their few belongings, her eyes searching the platform for the tall, bearded farmer whose photograph she had studied countless times. The wind carried the scent of dust and dried grass, speaking of a land both harsh and full of potential. Storm rubbed his eyes and asked quietly why Papa wasn't there to meet them. Using the name they had practiced calling the stranger who had promised to be their new father, Prairie clutched her worn doll closer, her young eyes wide with uncertainty. As they stepped onto the wooden platform, an elderly man with a badge approached them, his expression grave as he removed his hat and introduced himself as Sheriff Morrison, the lines around his eyes deepening with sympathy. The children moved closer to their mother as he began to speak, his words careful but unavoidable in their devastating honesty. He explained that a tornado had swept through the valley 3 days prior, taking with it not only Ezra Whitman and his entire farm but also several other families who had been caught unprepared by the sudden storm. Dot felt her knees weaken as the reality of their situation crashed over her like a wave, leaving her stranded with 2 children and no plan for survival. The other passengers moved past them, reuniting with their families while the Sterlings stood frozen in their unexpected grief. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Sheriff Morrison led them to his wagon and spoke in hushed tones about the destruction he had witnessed, describing how the Whitman property had been completely swept clean, except for the stone foundation and a twisted piece of the windmill. The fertile soil remained intact, he assured her, but everything else had been scattered across miles of prairie, leaving only memories and debris in its wake. As they rode toward the devastated farm, Dot saw the scope of the tornado's path, a dark scar across the landscape where homes, barns, and dreams had once stood. The children pressed against her as they approached the bare foundation where their new life was supposed to begin, the silence broken only by the whistle of wind through the remnants of what had been. In that moment of absolute desolation, Dot realized she faced a choice that would determine not only her family's survival, but also their capacity to rebuild from nothing. Storm was the first to speak, his young voice cutting through the heavy silence as he asked his mother if they would be going back to Illinois now that there was no house to live in. Prairie began to cry softly, overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all and the absence of the father figure who had existed only in letters and promises. Dot knelt beside the stone foundation, running her fingers over the solid rock that had withstood the storm, and found herself thinking not of retreat but of the possibilities hidden within the rich, dark soil. The sheriff watched her carefully, perhaps expecting tears or demands to be taken back to the train station immediately. Instead, she stood slowly and asked about temporary shelter, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to consume her resolve. That evening, in the cramped back room of the general store where the sheriff had arranged for them to stay, Dot spread her agricultural textbooks across the narrow bed, while her children slept fitfully on a makeshift pallet. The pages contained everything she had learned about soil conservation, crop rotation, and weather-resistant farming techniques that could transform the harsh prairie into productive farmland. She thought about Ezra's letters, which had mentioned traditional wheat farming and conventional methods that seemed to barely sustain the local farmers. The tornado had destroyed one dream, but perhaps it had also cleared the way for something entirely new. A chance to prove that scientific agriculture could not only survive but thrive in this challenging environment. Her fingers traced diagrams of windbreaks and drought-resistant crops as a new kind of hope began to take shape in her mind. The next morning brought a steady stream of curious neighbors to the general store, drawn by news of the mail-order bride, who had arrived to find her intended husband dead and her future erased by the storm. Klaus Zimmerman, a broad-shouldered German immigrant with calloused hands and suspicious eyes, was among the first to speak. His accent thick as he questioned why a woman with children would consider staying in such a hostile place. He gestured toward the window where the Whitman property lay bare, and declared that traditional farming methods had served his family for generations, suggesting that book learning had little value in the face of nature's raw power. Dot listened politely but felt the familiar frustration of having her expertise dismissed, simply because it came from a woman's mind. Storm and Prairie stayed close to her side, sensing the tension in the adult conversations that would determine their fate. Sheriff Morrison pulled Dot aside that afternoon and spoke frankly about her options, explaining that the county would arrange passage back to Illinois if she chose to return to her former life at the agricultural college. The practical choice was clear: she had no husband, no home, and no guarantee that the harsh Kansas climate would support any farming venture, especially one led by a woman alone. But as she looked out at the endless prairie and remembered the rich soil beneath the Whitman Foundation, Dot felt something stir within her that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with purpose. She thought of the drought-resistant seeds in her trunk, the windbreak designs in her notebooks, and the possibility of creating something revolutionary in this place where conventional wisdom had failed so catastrophically. When she turned back to the sheriff, her voice was clear and unwavering as she announced her decision to claim the Whitman property and begin again. The legal proceedings moved swiftly, with Ezra's will leaving the land to his intended wife and the county eager to have someone take responsibility for the property taxes and cleanup efforts. Dot signed the papers with a steady hand while Storm and Prairie watched wide-eyed, beginning to understand that their mother had chosen the difficult path over the safe one. Klaus Zimmerman shook his head in disapproval and muttered warnings about foolish women and the inevitability of failure, his words carrying the weight of traditional thinking that viewed innovation as dangerous deviation. Other neighbors maintained a cautious distance, willing to help with basic necessities but clearly skeptical about the newcomers' chances of survival. That evening, as they prepared to spend their first night camping on their own land under a canvas tarp stretched between wooden stakes, Dot felt the full weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. The first days on the property were filled with backbreaking labor as Dot and her children cleared debris, sorted through scattered belongings, and began to understand the scope of the work ahead. Storm proved surprisingly capable with tools, his young hands learning to grip a hammer properly as he helped his mother salvage usable lumber from the wreckage scattered across the prairie. Prairie appointed herself the keeper of small treasures, collecting buttons, bent spoons, and fragments of pottery that told stories of the lives that had been lost to the tornado. Each evening brought new challenges as they struggled to cook over an open fire, sleep on hard ground, and maintain hope in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Yet, Dot found herself energized by the physical work and the knowledge that every small improvement brought them closer to her vision of scientific farming success. Young Billy Watson appeared on the fourth day, riding up on a paint horse with his hat in his hands and curiosity written across his weathered face. The 19-year-old cowboy had heard talk in town about the professor lady who planned to farm differently, and his questions revealed a sharp intelligence hidden beneath his rough exterior. He offered to help with the heavy work in exchange for lessons about the new farming methods, explaining that he was tired of watching crops fail year after year despite backbreaking effort. Dot recognized the hunger for knowledge in his eyes and agreed to the arrangement, seeing in Billy the first potential ally in her mission to revolutionize prairie agriculture. That evening, as she showed him diagrams of contour farming and crop rotation, she felt the beginning of something larger than individual survival, the formation of a community built on innovation rather than tradition. Within 2 weeks, word had spread throughout the county about the scientific farming experiment taking place on the former Whitman property, drawing visitors ranging from genuinely curious neighbors to outright skeptics determined to witness inevitable failure. Dot found herself inhabiting a world where every decision was scrutinized, every method questioned, and every small success viewed as either miraculous or suspicious, depending on the observer's perspective. The daily routine of clearing land, testing soil, and planning crop layouts became a public performance, with Klaus Zimmerman making regular appearances to offer unsolicited advice and dire predictions. Storm and Prairie adapted to their new role as children of the experiment, learning to answer questions about their mother's methods with the confidence of true believers. As the first month ended and the foundation of a new kind of farm began to take shape, Dot realized she had crossed an invisible threshold from conventional widow to pioneering innovator, with all the isolation and opportunity that transformation entailed. The construction of their new home proceeded slowly but deliberately, with Dot incorporating storm-resistant design principles she had learned from studying tornado damage patterns in agricultural journals. Billy proved invaluable in the building process, his strong back and willing hands making up for his initial lack of carpentry knowledge, while Storm showed a natural aptitude for measuring and planning. Prairie took charge of the garden plot, her small fingers carefully planting seeds according to her mother's precise instructions about spacing and soil preparation. The neighbors who stopped by offered mixed reactions to the unusual design: the low profile, reinforced corners, and specially positioned root cellar that could serve as a tornado shelter. Klaus Zimmermann declared the whole structure overly complicated and predicted that the prairie winds would find weaknesses that traditional buildings had learned to withstand through generations of trial and error. As the weeks passed, an unexpected rhythm developed among the small group working on the Sterling property, with each member finding their particular strengths and responsibilities within the larger project. Billy's enthusiasm for learning proved contagious, and he began bringing other young men from neighboring farms who were curious about the new methods being tested. Storm emerged as a natural teacher, explaining soil testing procedures to visitors with the seriousness of someone twice his age, while Prairie's cheerful presence softened the skepticism of even the most doubtful neighbors. Dot found herself not just farming but building something resembling a school, with informal lessons taking place around the evening campfire as she shared knowledge from her textbooks. The sense of community that began to form felt different from anything she had experienced, more purposeful and forward than the academic environment she had left behind. The first real test of Dot's scientific methods came with the spring planting, as she introduced drought-resistant wheat varieties and implemented a crop rotation system that defied local convention. Her carefully planned windbreaks of fast-growing trees were met with laughter from some neighbors who couldn't understand why anyone would waste good farmland on trees that wouldn't produce income for years. Billy helped her mark the contour lines that would prevent erosion, his initial confusion giving way to genuine understanding as she explained how water movement could either destroy or preserve valuable topsoil. Storm and Prairie learned to recognize different types of seeds and understand the reasoning behind each planting decision. Becoming small ambassadors for their mother's methods, the physical work was exhausting, but Dot felt energized by the opportunity to finally apply her theoretical knowledge to real-world challenges. Klaus Zimmermann's visits became more frequent and more pointed as the growing season progressed, his criticism shifting from general skepticism to specific predictions about crop failure and financial ruin. He brought other traditional farmers with him, men who had worked the same land for decades and viewed innovation as a dangerous departure from proven methods. The discussions that ensued around Dot's kitchen table were often heated, with scientific principles competing against generational wisdom, in debates that sometimes lasted deep into the evening. Billy found himself caught between respect for his elders and excitement about new possibilities, his questions revealing the tension between tradition and progress that defined the entire community. Despite the criticism, Dot noticed that several of the visiting farmers took careful note of her methods, even as they publicly dismissed them as impractical book learning. The unexpected arrival of Professor James Mitchell from the State Agricultural College brought new legitimacy to Dot's experiments and sparked intense curiosity throughout the county. The elderly academic had traveled from Topeka specifically to observe the scientific farming techniques being implemented by his former student, his presence lending official weight to methods that neighbors had dismissed as feminine fancy. His detailed examination of the soil composition, crop placement, and construction techniques resulted in lengthy discussions that fascinated Billy and the children, while intimidating some of the local farmers. Storm and Prairie basked in the reflected glory of their mother's expertise, finally understanding that her knowledge was valued beyond the boundaries of their small community. Professor Mitchell's approval provided Dot with renewed confidence, but she also recognized that external validation could create new pressures and expectations for success. On a quiet evening after Professor Mitchell's departure, Dot stood in the doorway of their nearly completed home and watched Storm teach. prairie, the proper technique for testing soil moisture while Billy practiced identifying beneficial insects in the garden. The scene filled her with a profound sense of belonging that she had never experienced during her years of academic isolation. A feeling that this place and these people had become her true family. She thought of Ezra Whitman and wondered if he would have understood the depth of connection she felt to the land itself, not as property to be owned, but as a living system to be understood and nurtured. The realization struck her that she was no longer simply trying to prove scientific farming could work. She was fighting to protect a way of life that honored both tradition and progress. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, Dot made a silent promise to herself and her makeshift family that she would do whatever it took to make their experimental farm succeed. The summer drought arrived earlier and more severely than anyone had predicted, turning the prairie grass brown and brittle, while conventional wheat crops began to wither under the relentless sun. Klaus Zimmermann's fields, planted with traditional varieties and farming methods, showed the stress first, with yellowing stalks and reduced kernel development that spoke of reduced yields ahead. Dot's drought-resistant varieties initially showed more promise, their deeper root systems accessing moisture that conventional crops couldn't reach, while her windbreaks provided crucial protection from the desiccating winds. Billy marveled at the difference between the Sterling property and neighboring farms. His growing confidence in scientific methods bolstered by visible evidence of their effectiveness. However, even the experimental crops began to show stress as the drought continued week after week without relief. The weekly gatherings in town took on a new tension as farmers discussed the failing crops and debated the wisdom of various approaches to managing the crisis. Some of Klaus's supporters used the universal nature of the drought to argue that scientific farming offered no real advantage over traditional methods when nature itself turned hostile. Others pointed to the relatively better condition of Dot's experimental plots as evidence that innovation might indeed offer hope for the future. Billy found himself defending the Sterling methods in heated discussions at the general store, his passion sometimes outpacing his technical knowledge, but never wavering in his belief that education offered better solutions than resignation. The pressure of representing scientific farming in the community weighs heavily on the entire Sterling household, with Storm and Prairie sensing the adult anxiety, even when the specific concerns weren't explained to them. A traveling seed salesman arrived in late July with promises of miracle crops and guaranteed yields, his polished presentation attracting desperate farmers willing to try anything to save their season. Dot examined his samples with the critical eye of her scientific training and quickly identified them as common varieties repackaged with inflated claims and exorbitant prices. When she attempted to warn her neighbors about the deception, some accused her of jealousy and protectiveness over her own experimental methods, while others appreciated her expertise but felt too desperate to care about the truth. The incident highlighted the dangerous gap between scientific knowledge and public understanding, showing how crisis situations could make even reasonable people vulnerable to false promises. Klaus Zimmermann purchased several bags of the expensive seeds and publicly declared them superior to anything from the agricultural college, setting the stage for a direct comparison between approaches. Billy's enthusiasm for learning led him to organize informal evening classes where Dot shared advanced techniques for soil conservation and water management, drawing young men from farms across the county, despite their families' skepticism. The sessions took place in the Sterling barn, with lantern light illuminating hand-drawn diagrams and earnest faces hungry for knowledge that might save their family operations. Some attendees came secretly, afraid of their father's reactions to their participation in what was increasingly seen as radical experimentation, with dangerous potential consequences. Storm and Prairie served as teaching assistants, their comfort with scientific terminology and methods inspiring some of the older students, who had never imagined that children could understand such complex concepts. The growing educational movement represented both hope for the future and a challenge to traditional authority structures that had governed rural communities for generations. The first signs of crop failure began appearing in early August, with Klaus's traditional fields showing severe stress despite his confident predictions and vocal criticism of innovative methods. His expensive miracle seeds performed no better than his regular varieties, and significantly worse than Dot's carefully selected drought-resistant crops, creating visible evidence of the effectiveness of scientific agriculture. Other traditional farmers began experiencing similar problems. with wells running dry and livestock suffering from the extended period of high temperatures and minimal rainfall. The contrast between the Sterling property and neighboring farms became impossible to ignore, drawing visitors from increasingly distant locations who wanted to see the techniques that seemed to be working where others failed. However, the social pressure created by this success was beginning to manifest in unexpected ways, with some neighbors showing resentment rather than gratitude for the demonstration of effective methods. The county extension agent arrived in mid-August to assess the drought damage and document the various approaches being used by local farmers. His official report, likely to influence future agricultural policy. His examination of Dott's methods was thorough and professional, resulting in detailed measurements and photographs that validated the effectiveness of scientific farming techniques under difficult conditions. The agent's praise for the innovative approaches being tested on the Sterling property provided official recognition that delighted Billy and the children, while creating new tensions with traditional farmers. Klaus Zimmermann complained bitterly about the attention being given to book farming while generations of practical experience were being dismissed by government bureaucrats who had never faced a real agricultural crisis. The visit marked a turning point where the farm could no longer be dismissed as a curious hobby, but had to be acknowledged as a legitimate challenge to conventional wisdom. On a scorching afternoon in late August, Klaus Zimmermann arrived at the Sterling property with several other farmers and announced his intention to buy the land and implement proper farming methods that would restore traditional practices to what he considered a corrupted piece of prairie. His offer was substantial but came with the implicit threat that continued scientific experimentation would not be tolerated in a community that valued stability and proven approaches. Dott realized that Klaus represented more than individual opposition. He embodied the fear of change that could destroy everything she had worked to build, threatening not only her family's security but also the future of agricultural innovation in the region. Billy stepped forward to stand beside her, his young face set with determination, as he declared his willingness to defend the farm and its methods against any attempt to restore backward thinking. The confrontation crystallized the fundamental conflict between progress and tradition, making it clear that the success of the scientific farming experiment depended on more than good results, required the courage to fight for the right to think differently. The drought intensified through September, creating conditions that tested every farming method to its absolute limits and separated theoretical knowledge from practical effectiveness. Klaus's fields yielded less than half their normal production, while several of his supporters faced complete crop failure that threatened their family's survival through the coming winter. The miracle seeds he had purchased proved worthless, producing stunted plants that consumed precious water without generating marketable grain, humiliating him in front of the community he had attempted to lead. Meanwhile, Dott's experimental plots continued to outperform expectations, with drought-resistant varieties producing respectable yields despite the harsh conditions that devastated conventional crops. The visible contrast became impossible to deny, even for the most stubborn traditionalists who had dismissed scientific farming as untested theory. Billy's evening classes evolved into a formal agricultural cooperative as more farmers sought to learn and implement the methods that were proving successful on the Sterling property. The group included several of Klaus's former supporters, men who had quietly observed the growing disparity between traditional and innovative approaches throughout the difficult season. Dott found herself serving as an unofficial county agricultural advisor, providing guidance on everything from soil testing to crop selection while managing her own farm and raising her children. Storm and Prairie took pride in their roles as junior instructors, teaching visiting children about beneficial insects and proper planting techniques with the confidence of experienced farmers despite their young ages. The cooperative represented a new model for rural education and mutual support that challenged the individualistic traditions that had previously governed farming communities. A devastating hailstorm struck the county in early October, destroying most of the remaining traditional crops and testing Dott's storm-resistant building designs under real emergency conditions. The Sterling family and Billy took shelter in the specially designed root cellar, while other farmers suffered significant property damage from winds and hail that found weaknesses in conventional construction methods. When they emerged after the storm, they discovered that the low profile and reinforced construction of their buildings had minimized damage, while the windbreaks had protected crops from the worst of the hail damage. Klaus's farm suffered severe losses, with his barn roof torn off and his remaining crops completely destroyed, leaving him facing financial ruin and the humiliation of his failed leadership. The storm served as a final test of the scientific approaches Dot had implemented, providing dramatic proof that innovation could offer real protection against the prairie's harsh realities. In the aftermath of the hailstorm, unexpected support arrived from Professor Mitchell, who returned from Topeka with a team of graduate students and official backing from the State Agricultural College for expanded research on the Sterling property. The academic support provided credibility and resources that transformed Dot's individual experiment into a formally recognized research station with potential for influencing agricultural policy throughout the Great Plains region. Klaus found himself increasingly isolated as former allies either joined the cooperative or maintained neutral positions, leaving him with only a handful of the most conservative farmers still willing to support his traditional approaches. Billy was offered a scholarship to study at the Agricultural College, recognition of his rapid learning and teaching abilities that represented a path to advancement that would have been impossible under the old system of farming by instinct and tradition. The arrival of institutional support marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict between innovation and tradition. Dr. Samuel Hayes, a soil scientist from the Federal Agriculture Department, arrived unannounced in November with news that the Sterling property had been selected as one of 3 sites nationwide for a groundbreaking study of sustainable farming techniques adapted to challenging climates. His examination of the soil revealed that Dot's methods had actually improved the land's fertility despite the drought and hailstorm, with increased organic matter and enhanced water retention that would benefit future crops for years to come. The federal recognition represented validation at the highest level of government, transforming what had begun as a desperate widow's survival strategy into a model for agricultural development across the American frontier. Klaus realized that opposing the Sterling farm now meant opposing the federal government itself, a position that would isolate him completely from community support and potential sources of assistance for his own struggling operation. As Dr. Hayes explained the long-term implications of the research study, Dot understood that she had unknowingly positioned herself and her family at the center of a national transformation in agricultural science and policy. Klaus reached the height of his desperation when he challenged Dot to a public debate, believing his traditional farming experience would outshine her academic approach. The debate drew farmers from across the county to the schoolhouse, where Dot, backed by Billy, her cooperative members, and expert allies, presented scientific evidence and real results. The stakes were immense: credibility, the future of innovation, and the community's acceptance of new methods. The debate exposed Klaus's weaknesses as his appeals to tradition collapsed against Dot's data, testimonials, and the success of young farmers who had embraced change. With Professor Mitchell and Dr. Hayes lending authority, the audience's skepticism gave way to curiosity and support. By night's end, even Klaus's few supporters wanted to join the cooperative, signaling the collapse of his influence and the rise of scientific farming as a legitimate path forward. Shamed, Klaus resorted to sabotage, but when caught destroying property, he lost all remaining sympathy and was arrested. His downfall cleared the way for the cooperative to expand and formally organize as the Great Plains Agricultural Innovation Society. With Dot as president and Billy leading education as their work spread across counties and states, Dot faced her greatest personal test: whether to accept a prestigious federal post or remain in Kansas. Choosing her farm and community over national influence, she proved that grassroots leadership could drive lasting transformation. By 1890, Dot's vision had blossomed into a regional movement of sustainable, scientific farming. The cooperative's success during another tornado, when innovative farms withstood destruction that ruined traditional ones, cemented its credibility. National recognition followed, but Dot stayed rooted in Kansas, teaching and building a thriving community alongside Billy, Storm, and Prairie. From mail-order bride to tornado professor, she transformed disaster into opportunity, leaving a legacy of knowledge, resilience, and progress across the Great Plains.